morning. So I'm Brittany Mendiuk. I work for Alberta Infrastructure, and my role at Alberta Infrastructure is very vast. We at Alberta Infrastructure have adopted digital project delivery. Our first set of requirements were published in 2018. My role is to publish reiterations and improve those requirements, implement those requirements, provide support and leadership to our project teams so that they can deliver on those requirements, and then take those lessons learned and implement them back into our requirements. So I wear a lot of hats. But as it was kind of mentioned earlier this morning and through the panel, owners are not specifying what they want, what they need, not in enough detail. So I'm very proud to be part of that 1%. We're working on it, we're trying, our requirements are not perfect, but my presentation will kind of take us through the process of how to get closer to being set up so that you have those requirements detailed enough. Oh, technical difficulties? Middle button. Yep, middle button. There we go. Oh, back. So I want to start off by taking everyone through a hypothetical situation. I want everybody in the room to just pretend for a moment that you're an owner. You're an owner who has a portfolio of hundreds or thousands of buildings, and these buildings are spread across either an entire province or, even better, across an entire country. You've been recently made aware that there is a safety recall for a specific unit of fan coil units manufactured in a specific year, and it poses a threat to occupants' safety. What do? Your interests are time and money, right? How do you get an answer as to how many of these fan coil units are installed across your entire portfolio of buildings in a timely manner to reduce that risk? Do you go into the BIM models and click around? Do you trust the information that's in there? Do you go into your operation and maintenance manuals? This is very realistic as to what a records room looks like. Not immediately after handover, but after that building's been operational, been renovated several times. If that building is 20 years old, you can expect a records room to look like this. It does not, unfortunately, go away if you have digital copies. You just have this same mess digitally. So you have O&M manuals from when the building was first created. You'll then have O&M manuals for every major renovation that was done on that project. So which one has the most current, accurate information in it? Finding that information is very much like playing a Where is Waldo game. The good news is most owners do not operate their buildings using that paper documents or the PDFs. We use something called a CMMS system, which is a computerized maintenance management system. This is a database that's usually in-house, something proprietary. Middle button. There we go. And it's in charge of generating maintenance schedules, building inventory, keeping record of all of your inspections and certifications, as well as performance data. The problem is, and I clicked a little early, this information and this database is only as good as the information you put into it. So as an owner, at the end of a project, we get multiple different sources of information in different formats, and we have the task of sleuthing through all of these different sources of information, amalgamating them, and entering them into our CMMS. This is a manual entry process. So if you can imagine your operation and maintenance binder, your commissioning reports, all of your startup reports, all of your records, hand bombing that into a database takes months or years, depending on how complex your system is and how complex your building is. So really, it's a problem with manual entry. The root of this problem is that everything today starts off digital. Nobody is faxing copies of anything anymore. Nobody is hand drawing drawings anymore. We've moved beyond that with technology. So the technology is there, information is being input into a digital fashion, but we're still stuck in this downgrading of the format to hard copy for records. Then we as an owner are tasked with, again, putting that back into a digital database. So it's this transformation of formats from digital to paper back to digital, PDFs included. So at Alberta Infrastructure, our approach to digital project delivery is to take the information that starts off digitally and bring it directly across and remain in the digital world. It does not, at this point, get rid of the hard copy requirements because we still need them for legal purposes. We still need them as this is a record at this point in time. But by staying in the digital realm and bringing that across, we can eliminate that months or years of data entry. This is the most divisive slide that I have, and I'm willing to debate this to the ends of the earth with anyone who wants to talk to me about it afterwards. But BIM is not synonymous with DPD. BIM is not a single source answer to DPD. BIM is part of DPD. It can be. But I will say that it can also be an optional part of digital project delivery. I have seen digital project delivery done on a project using AutoCAD. Again, there are other sources of information that also need to be digitized. Some of these sources are the following. So we have PDF drawings, which everybody's familiar with, which we can now start to transition to getting something digital, editable, so that we as an owner can maintain our drawings and our records. If we get a PDF copy and that's the only one we get, when we have a renovation coming due, we don't have anything to edit. We don't have anything to update. So getting this is something that is of value for an owner. Hard copy binders, we're now moving to digital documents. So PDFs, bookmarked PDFs, or you can take it one step further and do a web-hosted ebook. Again, it doesn't replace the hard copy, but it's something that provides more value. Your as-built drawings, your red lines, your hand marked up red lines, we're starting to now ask for digital markups. So something that can be replicatable, that you're not going to lose your only copy of. And then taking that one step further, you can start now asking for laser scanning, which is infinitely more accurate than a hand marked up drawing. So as an owner, we can open up a laser scan and see what's behind a wall without needing to rip out that wall to find out what's back there. And lastly, that manual data entry that I'm talking about for all of your asset data, everything that's in your model, in your commissioning reports, in your shop drawings, we're now starting to ask for digital asset data. The good news is industry is already moving in this direction. All of the top ones are things that are commonplace practice for a lot of owners and a lot of contracts. The one problem is this digital asset data. This is something that industry is falling behind on and is not doing very well. So what is digital asset information management? The overall kind of concept is that all of the different stakeholders, as they get brought on, as they contribute through that iterative process that we saw during our panel, they input the pieces of information that are reasonable for them to input, right? Nobody's going to be inputting something that somebody else has a responsibility to do. And so as information gets entered into this central database, the database increases in size as you kind of go throughout the project maturity. The problem is, technology is not the fix-all solution for this. If you have multiple collaborators collaborating in a common data environment, you can have the most sophisticated common data environment in the world. Everybody can be inputting it. Your process can be super, super well defined, but you're still going to end up with a digital mess. The reason for that is data standards. One example, the best example I have, is how many ways are there to enter a date format. If you have every company entering your date format differently, you're going to end up with this digital mess. So technology is not the answer here. You need really, really well-defined, really detailed requirements around your data standards in order to ensure that you're getting that clean data that you want. So this is a monumental task. It's no surprise that owners don't have this done yet. There's a lot of confusion about how detailed to go. So the best place to start when you're embarking on a big organizational change like that is to define your current state. So what are you asking for currently? Why are you asking for it? What's working? What's not working? Do a self-evaluation of your organization to see what is outdated and what is working. And always focus on the why, the value. Why are we asking for this in the first place? What value is this providing us as an organization? And you have to do this with complete honesty, because you may be surprised at some of the information that you find. So, for example, if you have language in your requirements talking about different colored pencils to record information, if you have more information about the binder structure than the actual information contained in the binders, these may be areas that you can identify as a problem. Also consider the timing of these deliverables. So if you're still looking at receiving everything at handover or substantial completion, you're facing this monumental learning curve. Whereas if you're asking for information in a staggered approach, where you get to review it, you get to familiarize, you're reducing that learning curve. So once you have your starting point, you can start to define your requirements around what those problem statements are that you've identified. So a lot of these things are identifying, again, the why. Why are you going to ask for what you intend to ask for? What purpose does it solve? What are your assets that you need information on? And assets, everybody likes to think of equipment, but assets could be anything. Assets could be a parking lot. Assets could be individual spaces within a building, right? Anything that you want to track or have data on is considered an asset. How much information do you need on all of those different assets? And consider the information you need on a pump is going to be very different than the information you need on a room, right? So level of information need was mentioned on the panel earlier. This is something that is really, really important. When do you need that information? So again, the timing of when that information is being delivered or input into a database, and what format. We're going to go through this in a lot of detail. The big takeaway is when you think you're finished writing your requirements and you put them into a project, you will quickly find out that you are not finished writing your requirements. All the holes will become available, all the questions that you hadn't considered will come up, and so this is a very iterative process. The good news is, and this standard was mentioned a few times, if you're not familiar with it, I would get very familiar with it. The ISO 19650 has a framework for this exact process. So for owners to follow to create their requirements. This is that framework. It seems really complicated, and we will break it down step by step. So the first step is your organizational information requirements. This is your why. This is why are you asking for the information you're asking for? What objectives do you have? What tasks do you as an owner have to complete? So a lot of this has to tie into your business objectives. So you may need to ask, what does your organization do? What are your organization's goals? What are your strategic goals, right? What are you trying to achieve? And you have to consider all your departments. So that's including areas that you wouldn't otherwise think about, like your space planning department, your IT department, right? Everybody has to be at the table when you're creating your organizational requirements. And this process of creating your business objectives and defining this is a lot easier if you already have a strategic asset management plan. A lot of that information that is to do with your why and what information you need will already be identified in your strategic asset management plan. Further to business objectives, you may have multiple. You're very likely to have multiple. So it's really important to put them in order of priority. So knowing what are your overarching business objectives and what are your operational business objectives. Things that apply to the entire organization versus things that apply to a specific project team or facility management team. The next step after you've defined your why, or what information you need to suit your why, is the what. What do you need? As an owner, what information do you need to satisfy all of those whys? This is broken out into two phases. So one is your project information requirements. This is all the information to do with the delivery phase of a project. Oftentimes this gets archived at the end of a project after handover. So things like meeting minutes, things like budgets, things like progress reports. All of this stuff is really important during the delivery phase, but then when you're into operations, it gets archived. The other side is that operations phase information. So what information lives beyond handover that you're actually going to use when you're operating your building? For the purposes of this presentation, I'm not going to get into project information delivery. That's pretty well defined. I find that most everybody knows kind of what they need to deliver as far as progress reports, meeting minutes, all of that information. What I'm going to focus on more is your operational phase requirements. And this is kind of broken down into three parts. I have broken this down into three parts because the asset information, the organizational or the operations phase, asset information requirements is going to be the most of your work. This is where you want to get into the most detail you can. You want to be as prescriptive as you can, and you need to define this in as much detail as you can so that when you give your requirements to your project teams, they understand what it is they have to deliver. So the three kind of parts that it's broken into is, firstly, how do you structure your data? This is super important because when you get into collecting massive amounts of data, not just for one building, but for an entire portfolio, how you organize your data, how you structure it is going to be important. What are your assets? So what items do you want them to capture? Do you want them to capture your structural columns, or do you want them to capture your pumps and your equipment, your spaces, your parking lots? And how much information, what information do you need on each of those assets? So those are the kind of the three parts, which we'll go into in a little more detail. So first, structuring your data. It's not a sexy topic. It's not something that people like to talk about. It's a snooze fest, and I understand. But this is absolutely critical. You need to define this first. You have to define, as an organization, how are you going to structure your data internally, because that's going to have impacts on how you report your data, how you query your data. So you need to define how you're structuring it. And my best advice is pick something that's industry standard. If you go a custom method, it's going to pose a learning curve on all of your project teams. They're going to have to learn your standard, and that's going to be repeated for every single project. So pick something industry standard, pick something that people are familiar with, that is well documented, and use that to structure your information. The next part is identifying your assets. So what are your assets? Kind of the first step is starting with some sort of master list. So again, this could be a list based on any of those previous classification standards that were on the screen. And have that master list ready. Have that as an internal template. The next step is to consider the detail level. So how detailed do you need to go? Is heating equipment enough detail for you as an organization to meet your goals? Or do you need to go down to boilers? Or do you need to go down to gas versus electric boilers? How much detail do you need within your data structure? Think about work orders. It's a really good place to start. If something is maintainable, if something's going to be repaired rather than replaced, it's likely that that is an asset you want to track. And lastly, have something that can be project tailored. So not all of your assets are going to be the same for every single project. If you're doing an office building versus a hospital, your asset list will look very different. So again, start with that master list, know how much detail you need, but then tailor it to suit the needs of your project. That can be something that can be done collaboratively with your project team, or you can do that ahead of time and have that included in your contract. Again, once you've identified what assets you want, it's really important to prioritize them. The best example I can come up with for this is door hardware. If you're designing, again, an office building, your door hardware is going to be pretty low on your asset priority list. However, if you're designing a correctional facility, all of a sudden your door hardware becomes much more important, much more critical. So rank your assets in terms of criticality so that you know kind of what your main areas of focus are and what your nice to haves will be. And next is defining how much information you need on each one of those assets. So how much information do you need on your door hardware? How much information do you need on that pump? Do you want performance curves? Or are you just looking for minimum manufacturer, model number, location, right? Identify how much information you need. And one thing to consider here, and I can't stress this enough, is understanding the implications of what you're asking for. So if you're sticking with the core information, just the ID number, the tag number, the description, the location, you're looking at a low amount of detail, but it's easier to maintain in the long run, right? You're not maintaining thousands of fields of data, you're maintaining a few. It's also lower effort to collect from your project teams, so your consultants, your contractors, your subs. If you don't inundate them with thousands of fields of data, they are more likely to be able to collect it successfully. On the other end, if you do need a higher amount of detail, just know that it is going to be harder to maintain. So you're not just biting off this effort at the beginning when your project's being delivered, but you now have to sustain that effort through the entire building life cycle. So when a pump is replaced, you're now not replacing a few pieces of information, you're replacing a lot of pieces of information. So the internal workload on that is quite high. And it's also higher effort to collect in the first place. So when your building's first being built and first being handed over to you, the burden on your consultant and contractor teams is going to be a lot higher. So it's something to keep in mind. The best example of this that I have is effort versus value. Everybody knows that it would be great to go into a model or go into a CMMS and select an outlet and know exactly what circuit and what panel and what system that outlet is on. But there are implications for that. There's a multiplier effect. So first, you would have to know how many electrical systems you have in your building. This is high voltage, low voltage, emergency power. Next, you have to know how many panels you have on each electrical system. So you're now taking the number of systems multiplied by the number of panels. Next, you have to capture all of your circuits. So you're looking at number of systems multiplied by panels multiplied by circuits. So you can see this gets exponentially bigger. And then lastly, to get to the point where you want to click on the outlet and know all the information about it, you're collecting number of systems, number of panels, times number of circuits, times number of outlets you have in your building. I don't know how many of you have counted the number of outlets you have in your building, but we're now talking about a substantial amount of information and data entry, just so you can understand what that outlet is connected to when you click it. So understand the implications, the effort versus the value you're getting from it. Focus on what's critical, not what's nice to have. The next part here, once you've defined what information you want on what assets, is your exchange information requirements. This is your who and your when. So again, this speaks to the responsibilities, right, that we had talked about earlier during the panel. So who's responsible to deliver that what and at what point in the project? So consider timing of your deliverables, right? If you're phasing this out rather than asking for it all at substantial completion, you have more opportunity to review. So always start with requiring information at each phase. So understanding what limitations there are to that as well. You can't ask for a manufacturer and a model number at schematic design because that information is just not finalized yet. So as information gets finalized, you can start to ask for it, but do understand what the limitations are. Define clear roles and responsibilities. Who is entering the manufacturer and model number, right? If you're asking your consultants to do it, they're really just going to get that information from the contractors and subs anyway. So knowing whose responsibility it is to enter information at what phase is really, really important. And then, again, I can't stress this enough, frequent reviews and frequent feedback loops are super, super important. If you have the most detailed set of requirements and you put them in place and you walk away, chances are you're not going to get what you expect at the end. So you absolutely have to have those frequent feedback loops. So I find the most successful way to do this is to tie those check-in points to existing phases in your project. So have a review at design development, have a review before things are issued for tender, and then throughout different progress points during construction, again, have those checkpoints. The last part here is the deliverable itself. So these are your asset information model and your project information model. Do not confuse these with a 3D model. This is your whole package. This is all the deliverables that you need. The word model is just used. So this is your entire deliverable and what you want. And this is the how and the where. So what format do you want it in? How do you want it delivered to you? And where are we putting this? Are we sending it to you through an FTP site? Are we loading it into your database for you? That's all really, really important. The number one consideration that I have here is don't overcomplicate your internal processes. So don't ask for some sort of format that you're not familiar with. Don't ask for a format that you can't actually digest or accept. Keep your project delivery simple. So simplify your process of getting information from your project teams and loading it into your internal systems. This doesn't have to be super sophisticated. I think that's a misconception, right? You don't have to be doing LOD 500 BIM 3D models collaboratively with an IPD in order to get this information. You can simplify it, right? Again, you can also simplify it based on project type. So there's different formats that you can ask for, and I will go through a few. The first, you can actually collect a lot of this digital information in PDF forms. If you have templates in place, you can put in your requirements that they have to be filled out by such and such on such and such time. The pros and cons, PDF forms are simple, right? They're pretty foolproof, and they have predefined fields. So you'll know right away if you're missing some data. The problem is it's not scalable. Doing this for like a multi-million-dollar project is probably not the best approach. And one consideration that you have to keep in mind is to extract that data out of those forms, even if it is entered digitally, will take some scripting. Kind of one more step towards that sophisticated level, spreadsheets, right? A little bit more scalable, still really simple. One really good thing about them is universal importing, right? It doesn't matter what your CMMS system is. It will accept a spreadsheet, or it will accept a CSV file. The problem is they're easy to break. If you get handed a really sophisticated spreadsheet with all sorts of formulas, lookup tables, it's really, really easy to break. So make sure your templates are foolproof. And some considerations that you have to keep in mind are data validation and strict templates. So if you just put a few headers and say, okay, fill in this information, chances are you're not going to get what you want. Next, and this is kind of something that we did talk about a little bit in the panel, is getting this information in a data-rich model. So you can have your project team load all this information back into your model if you specify who's putting it in at what time. Some pros is it integrates directly into the process. If they're already using BIM and already using 3D models, then this can become very intuitive. Also, you get really strong visualization that you wouldn't otherwise get from some of the other formats. The problem, and this is the main problem that we've discovered at Infrastructure, it takes specialized skills to open a model and navigate the model and find what you're looking for. Our operations staff, who've been doing building operations for 50 plus years, are not going to learn this. They just simply won't open a 3D model and walk through it and find what they're looking for. So usability. The other negative is I don't know how many people have tried to embed documents or hyperlinks into a model. It does not do documents very well. So there are still documents that you need to have, shop drawings, etc., that just won't be doable in this format. The other requirements or considerations that you'll need to take is there will be an API required. So this doesn't directly integrate with CMMS systems very well unless you have the latest and greatest internal software, which for most owners, it's really difficult to upgrade your internal historical databases and platforms. So you will need some sort of API, some sort of coding to integrate this model into your existing CMMS systems because usually it doesn't exist. And the other problem, which is the elephant in the room, there's a high variation. What one company does in their models is going to be very different than another company does in their models. So extracting that information out of your model may be a monumental task that you have to repeat every project because your model standards may be different. And then lastly, there's one more surprise one, is you can have your information entered directly into your client database. So there's no import effort when you do it this way. You have predefined fields because those are the fields that exist in your database. The problems are there's a learning curve, again, for your project teams. They're unfamiliar with your database. They're unfamiliar with your internal software. So it's going to be a huge learning curve for them. And that will repeat for every project. And there's a high risk of error because of that learning curve. So if you're giving them unsupervised access to your internal database, you have a high risk of error. The other consideration is external access and permissions. Does your organization even allow external access to those databases? Right. These are all considerations that you'll have to take into account if you're going down that method. And then lastly, there are open formats, which is where a lot of government bodies are going. So open formats are usually software agnostic, and they're usually consistent because they adhere to strict data formatting and data standards internally for that file format. Some of the cons, they can be overly complicated. If you're doing a simple boiler replacement, you're not going to ask for a giant file just for that one boiler replacement, right? So they're not always suitable. And the other con is they're not customizable. So you can't change things within a standard that exists. The other part for consideration is quality control. You have to have quality control processes in place in order to check these different open standards. And then understanding and education. A lot of consultants, contractors, and subs are really, really unfamiliar with a lot of these open standards. So the IFC standard is one of these standards. Within the IFC standard, there is a sub category for COBie files, which is what Alberta Infrastructure has adopted. And I do want to touch on why we've adopted it, because I do get that question a lot. Public sector is held to very strict inclusivity policies. So we can't just go say, use this software from this vendor because we'll get in a pile of trouble. So we have to be inclusive. So we can't do any sole sourcing. We also want to be in the business of specifying the output and the deliverable, but we don't want to infringe on the means and methods, right? We don't want to come in and say, contractor, consultant, who are the subject matter experts, do it this way. They should be able to innovate. They should be able to come up with their own internal processes, their own means and methods, as long as it meets our specified deliverables at the end. And we've also adopted this because it ensures consistency, regardless of the stakeholders' internal processes. So again, we didn't go down that data-rich model route because every model you receive will be set up differently, will have different parameters, and it is like sleuthing through a huge file to find what you need. So by adopting an open standard like a COBie file, we have consistency, regardless of what the internal processes and workflows are. If your organization is not held to these same standards, you're probably better off not going down the route of a COBie file. I just want to stress that there is more than one way to capture this data. Just because Alberta Infrastructure or other public sectors are doing it this way doesn't mean it's most suitable for what you're doing. So do still consider the other options. The next is lessons learned about these different deliverable formats. So firstly, don't specify a format that you can't use. I have seen this with an owner that will remain nameless, where they've said, oh, infrastructure is doing COBie files. We should do COBie files too. They put it into their contract, and then they got it, and they had no idea what to do with it. So all of that valuable information sat in this COBie file and didn't make it into their CMMS platform, which was the goal in the first place. So don't specify a software that you're not familiar with, don't specify a data format that you're not familiar with, and make sure it's usable so that when you're on the receiving end of it, you know what you can do with it. Define the format early and don't change it. If you change the data format early or halfway through a process, your consultants and stakeholders are not going to be happy with you. So define it early, put it in the contract, and then don't change it. You have opportunity to change your requirements between contracts. Don't do it during. You're opening up a whole bunch of cost considerations that you just don't want to open that can of worms. Again, allow your teams to innovate. Specify what you want, but don't specify how they're supposed to do it. Again, we as owners sometimes get left behind as far as technology developments. So for me to say you should use this software, that may be outdated in a week's time. So don't write those kinds of things into your requirements. Let the industry innovate, right? There's no sense in trying to keep your requirements up to speed with the latest technology. And lastly, document your ROI. So document how successful was it? What worked well when you implemented these requirements into a project? And document your lessons learned. If the file that you got was not directly importable into your CMMS system, understand why. Look into it further and define what the causes were so that you can avoid those on future projects. So that is the ISO 19650 framework kind of broken down, simplified. I agree it may be an oversimplification for people that are familiar, but it's a place to start. Now, how do you make it contractual? Well, firstly, your organization information requirements is an internal document. That's something for you to have as part of your strategic plan, and it's not something you typically share. You can share that through narratives, through supporting document to understand why you're doing it, like conferences like this. But really, it's not something you're going to put in your contracts. All of this information, your exchange information requirements, your asset information requirements, and your project information requirements, all of the who, when, and what, is the bulk of your contract. Absolutely have all of these as well defined as you can and put them in your upfront requirements. This is going to be crucial. Absolutely crucial. And then lastly, the how, right? How are they delivering it, in what format, et cetera, et cetera. There's an option. You can have that contractually defined as to say, we're having you input this into our database. Here's your access, here's your sign-in, here's your permissions. Or you can have that through execution plans, right? So again, the means and methods, there's an option there, right? You can define it, or you can leave it up to your project teams to innovate. Again, I would say define your format, but then let them innovate on the means and methods as to how they're going to meet that deliverable. So once you do have all this language, once you do know, and you've gone through the monumental task of defining all of this detail of what you want, where do you put it? So firstly, put it in your upfront contracts. So the contract language. If you don't have contracts that have this kind of language in them already, there are templates available through the IBC BIM contract appendixes. They're a good place to start. They won't get into this amount of detail. They're not going to relieve you of writing all these requirements, but they'll give you a place to put them in your upfront contracts. Put it in your schedule of services, or have another schedule, right? This ties it directly to payment. This puts it upfront where everyone will see it. So what are your deliverables? List them in your Schedule A. And then also master specifications. A lot of times, the people that are actually executing the work don't see the upfront contract. They're looking at the specification sections that apply to them. So make sure that you have consistency in your master specifications as well, so that everybody all the way down the chain of command gets to see what those requirements are. And then lastly, and this is my final point, do not disengage. As an owner, we are the subject matter experts of what we want. You can't let consultants, contractors, subs assume what provides you value. You have to tell them. So absolutely stay engaged with your project teams. Have a representative, right? Whether that's somebody as a subject matter expert in-house, or if you're third-partying it out, right? Have that representative present on your projects. You have to provide support and guidance to your teams. This is going to be new for them, especially when you get into all of your detailed requirements. It's going to be a massive amount of information, and they will need support and guidance. So you will have to have somebody that can provide that to your project teams in order to be successful. The more engaged you stay in this process and in your projects, the more insight you're going to gain. So you'll get insight into what is working, what isn't working, what's confusing. You may get asked questions that you hadn't previously considered and that you may not even have answers to at the time. So staying engaged will actually help inform your future iterations of your requirements, right? Whereas if you drop your requirements and walk away, you're losing all that really valuable insight that you might be able to gain. And lastly, and I will stress this over and over and over, the owners have to be the subject matter experts for the operations phase. So you have to advocate for what you want. A lot of time, up till this point, owners didn't know there was an alternative, right? So they didn't know there was an alternative to binders and paper and hard copy. And they didn't know there was a way to import the data into their CMMS system. But if you leave it up to your architects, your engineers, your contractors, and your subs to specify what your information you're going to need 50 years down the line, you're going to find that that's going to come up short. So you as an owner, you as your facility management team have to be the subject matter experts on what you want and why you want it. So you have to absolutely be present in these conversations. So that's me. I'm going to open it up to questions and discussion. I think we're back on track for time. Anybody else in the virtual audience, feel free to contact me. I like to have these conversations, whether it's you disagreed with something I said, you're confused, or if you want more insight into what infrastructure is doing and our requirements, feel free to get in touch.
Tom, do we want to do a...
Okay, we are behind schedule, so we're only going to do a couple of questions.
I know Jerry's got a whole stack of questions that came in from
Online.
the audience. So, Jerry, why don't you pick like one or two? And then
I'll pick one here from Aman. And the question is, what is a relatively efficient process to centralize your data in a digital manner to your central repository of the existing assets for an organization such as a university? Do you want me to repeat that?
that was quite a wordy question. I think, can you repeat it one more?
Okay. So what is a relatively efficient process to centralize your data in a digital manner for your central repository of the existing assets for an organization such as a university?
Existing assets. Oh gosh. So firstly, I will say something I didn't mention in my presentation is you don't have to abandon your legacy and historic software. If you have a database in place that has your historical information and your legacy data, don't abandon it to try to improve and move more digital, right? You can still use it. Just find ways to include new builds into it. As far as buildings that have already been built and you don't have information for, I don't have an answer. We have, in the past, taken on an endeavor where we did have a building that was constructed. It did have a model. It did have some digital deliverables, but we didn't have a COBie file for it. And we went down the third-party route where we said, okay, here's all the record information, everything that was turned over to us at turnover. Please take it and put it into a COBie file for us. And you would be absolutely floored by the amount of information that was missing. The project will remain nameless because I don't want to get anyone in trouble. But you don't know what's not in your O&M manuals and what's not in your records until you go looking for it. So for historical buildings, I don't have a solution for that, unfortunately. It's kind of it comes back to that manual slogging and digging through and entering manual entry. So that's why it's absolutely crucial to have this in your upfront contracts for any new builds. You can also do it for renovation projects, but going back and collecting it for your portfolio of buildings is a challenge, and I don't have a solution for that yet.
Tom, one more, or do you?
Anybody from the audience?
I'll be right there. It's coming.
We need some like Jeopardy music. There's a question from the audience. Everyone online, just hold tight.
Hi, thanks for the presentation and the detailed practical way you've looked at it too. Just to clarify, has Alberta infrastructure, through that last slide that you mentioned on the contractual language that you put, has that brought light to the legality issue that you talked about at the beginning between digital to paper back to digital, where we're required, or like clients are still requiring that paper from a legality perspective? Has that changed, or have you actually dealt with that?
No.
Part of it?
So I would say it hasn't changed. And I think I know kind of the topic we're dancing around a little bit, which is when are models going to be able to be issued for construction? When can we get rid of drawings? I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think that we can start leaning on models more and more, but from a legal perspective, internally, we're just now exploring digital signatures, right? So getting into a place where you can stamp a model and following kind of Singapore, where you can submit a model for permits, I think is quite a long ways off. So long answer short, no, it hasn't changed that. What it has done is historically we've asked for several hard copies. I think the most I've seen is 5 copies of the O&M binders, which are huge. So what we've been able to do is we've been able to reduce that down to 1 copy, because now we have something digital that is replicable. So we're not going to lose our only copy, so we no longer have to ask for 5 copies of these binders, right? So we're starting to get to the place where we can reduce what we're asking for. From a legal standpoint, no, we're not getting to the point where we can accept a model with a stamp on it. Cool. Thanks, guys.